Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Do More Optimism podcast. I'm Simon. I'm here with Shane, a returning guest, now co-host. We're super excited today to have Joseph Lofthouse on, talking about landrace gardening, as well as Shane. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. Been following Joseph's work for a couple of years. I discovered him on Permies several years ago, and the whole landrace thing as I was amping up my gardening, and more recently came across Shane through his blog Zero Input Agriculture, and was very excited to be able to interview him about a month ago now. And having both of them together on this podcast is going to be very exciting for all the gardening nerds out there. So thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
So for those unfamiliar, maybe Joseph, do you want to start with giving us a quick definition of landrace gardening?
Sure. A landrace is a variety that has enough genetic diversity in it that it can become locally adapted. And so landraces are about a particular population in a particular location. And what genetic diversity does when combined with cross-pollination is it allows them to undergo survival of the fittest selection to become really thrive in our local ecosystems.
Nice. And Shane, you do some similar type of breeding. Do you have what do you call that? Do you consider it landrace breeding, or?
Yeah, I have a lot in common with the principles behind landrace breeding. Probably the only variation is I'm a little bit more interested in novel and orphan crops. So even taking wild species and going through the process of domestication, which I think a lot of people don't realize you can do it easily within a lifetime if you pick the right starting point.
Sure. I think that was one of the most exciting things after reading about landrace gardening, and I'm about halfway through the book now, but like even knowing what I did after reading through all the Mother Earth news articles and stuff, like it's how capable it is as a method to come up with completely, like you say, like novel and resilient crops, basically full of genetics, which is a pretty beautiful thing, I think, especially for those who are interested in gardening. What's so important about landrace or like breeding plants to you two?
Well, I had to start breeding plants in my own garden because I couldn't trust the seed catalogs to give me varieties that would grow here. I grow up in a high elevation mountain in the desert, and the cold air comes off of the mountains all summer long. Like we've had frost in midsummer 2 of the last five years, and so I just couldn't reliably grow most of the crops from the seed catalogs, and so I had to start breeding them myself. And once I started doing that, I found out that genetic diversity and cross-pollination was just critical, because then the plants can solve for themselves all of the problems that I would otherwise be solving with tarps or greenhouses or poisons. And so that really simplified my gardening.
And yeah, I would absolutely agree that the principle of changing the crops to suit the conditions that you already have, rather than going to the enormous amount of work to try and do the opposite, to coddle plants that would rather die.
Yeah, I think that was one thing that really stood out to me about the approach too, was that it's actually easier to modify the genetics of a plant breed or a variety or a landrace than it is to deal with all the fertilizer and the pests and the potential microclimates that you might have to build, and the soil and any amendments.
Right, because if I start changing the soil, I have to change it every single growing season.
Right.
And if I change the genetics of the plant, it's a one-time deal, and then it's permanent in my garden.
Under my conditions, I also have the difficulty that I can't irrigate. So I'm living in a place that doesn't have town water, doesn't have any mode of irrigation. So And if you look at the average climate, it looks pretty hospitable, but we swing back and forth between extreme wet years and extreme dry years. So coming up with plants with really strong root systems that really love the soil that we have means that I can get around having to do that. And it's amazing. I don't miss watering. It's not something that I really enjoyed having to do and worrying about missing, one day of watering and the whole crop collapsing.
Mm-hmm. So in the desert here, we have a wild species of brassica, and I keep thinking, oh, I should domesticate that.
Do it.
Yeah, do it. We've got all sorts of bitter mustard, I think, growing out here too, and it grows nice and big, and it's already out. And even though it's frosting, it's popping up everywhere. So, yeah, there's so much opportunity for that once you get in that mode. What's the most promising thing you're growing right now, or that you're working with?
You want to answer this, Shane?
No, I'll let you go first.
Okay. So the thing that really captures my heart right now is the promiscuous tomatoes, because what happened when tomatoes got domesticated is they left 95% of their genetics in the wild. And so they're really hard to breed with domestic tomatoes because they just don't have enough genetic diversity in order to really thrive. And so what I've done is I've gone to the wild tomatoes and I brought all of that genetic diversity in. And so my strategy right now is to take a few genes from the domestic tomatoes and put them into the wild tomatoes. Rather than just bringing one gene out of the wild tomatoes for a disease resistance, I'm just going the opposite way and taking, the 5 genes that we really care about for domestic tomatoes, putting them in a wild tomato background. And so that will allow the tomatoes to solve their own problems for themselves about blights and stuff like that. If we think about a tomato and we make an heirloom out of it, in 50 generations, that heirloom is basically a clone of itself. But in that same 50 generations, if we were dealing with promiscuous tomatoes, there would be 600 trillion opportunities for the genetics to switch themselves up. And that's a lot of opportunities for them to really figure out what's going on with the ecosystem.
To answer your question, and then we'll get on to another point, the things I'm most interested in the moment are I've been hybridizing 3 different species of sword beans. So they're a fairly hardy, mostly subtropical, tropical staple legume. Used a little bit as a vegetable on the side as well too. So yeah, I've finally figured out how to do controlled pollination of those to stop them self-pollinating like they normally do. And yeah, I have one species that's kind of wild and one that's a little bit too domesticated. It's just a bit too weak. And there's one that I was growing before that I can actually plant all through my orchard, and it mostly takes care of itself until it needs to be harvested. But it's a very narrowly inbred self-pollinating clone that's been around for probably centuries in pretty much the same form. So the idea is to add some genetic diversity to that form that's almost good enough to do the job for me, and then select out a new, fresher strain that absolutely loves my local conditions.
Nice.
But it makes me wonder if there is an underlying pattern in both agriculture and nature that you go through these like outcrossing hybridization events once in a blue moon, create a highly diverse population that then finds a new niche to specialize into. And eventually it becomes so good at just being in that niche that it becomes more and more inbred until it reaches the point where it has to hybridize again. It's almost like a braided knot on different scales that you have threads where there's individual plants crossing with each other within a species, but occasionally widely spread threads of different species cross over and create a whole new pattern. And there's that repeated pattern in nature.
That particularly happens in the wild tomatoes. It's been pretty easy to follow, where they, at the very extreme edges of their range, they'll become highly inbreeding. And And so I think that's probably a general pattern.
Mm. So yeah, we can emulate that as plant breeders.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of which, I wanted to ask you what your opinions are of Luther Burbank. Have you looked much into what he did?
Well, I think that his magic was the ability to look, the ability to see, and like he would take 10,000 seeds and plant them all in a field, and then he'd walk through the field and say, here's one that's different.
Mm.
And I think that's what his magic was.
And I think that's the kind of culture or attitude that humans are unusually good at, and that we can learn from each other to nurture those. Because like often when you hybridize two different species, you don't get an instant result. You get all sorts of weirdos that like don't fit in anywhere to begin. But humans have that ability to like nurture through those early embryonic phases where the new species isn't quite ready to stand on its own 2 feet. So yeah, that's kind of my thing, is saying that human beings have the potential to be the universal symbiont, that we can interface with every other organism on the planet and come into a relationship with it. And there's no other creature that's been able to do that before.
Right.
Nice. What? Sorry, go ahead, Shane.
So I had another question too. So Joseph had a background in analytical chemistry and kind of turned away from that to become a plant breeder. And that's very similar to Fukuoka. He was a lab plant pathologist who spent his early years like just, pouring chemicals on plants in the lab. Oh, you got it. You got it. So, and I had a lab background as well too. And through like trying to study formally biology the way, you're supposed to do it if you're a proper scientist, I kind of realized how futile the effort is to kind of like break things down into individual elements and like understand everything. So I wondered if you could talk a bit more about that journey for you, like starting in formal science and then deciding it didn't lead anywhere.
So I was actually an analytical chemist, and we were developing pesticides and just nasty, terrible things to use against people, against insects, and I ended up mental over it and ended up in a monastery. And I'm like, I got to do the exact opposite of that, which was returning to my roots as a farmer and living as simple as I possibly could. And I am delighted that I don't have any training in botany, because I look at what's going on in botany, and they define a species, for example, as if it can't cross with each other, then they're separate species. But I can cross 4 species of tomato with each other in any direction and they cross just fine. Yeah. And so to me, as a non-botanist, I'm saying those are the same species. And in other things, like Shane, you're crossing 3 species of sword beans, and it's like, so all of that sort of dogma that the botany profession wants to put on me, I'm glad it's not there, because it gives me the freedom to actually look with my own eyes and make my own conclusions. And yeah.
That's what I find so wild about Burbank's work. Like if you went to a trained botanist and said, oh, what if I cross a raspberry with a quince? They'd be like, oh, they're a different genera. That'll never happen. And you're like, someone did it like over a century ago. You're just ignoring it. And they'll be like, oh, that's interesting. And then they'll just never think of the idea ever again.
There's another Lysenko from Russia.
Oh, yes.
That had a lot of anti-botany ideas that we're just now starting to learn are really good ideas.
Well, on that on that thread, do you think there's more to plant breeding than just DNA and genes? That there's an iceberg that we haven't quite figured out? I mean, the genome itself is an iceberg. Like, we can pick out one gene at a time and say we think it does this, but the rest of it's a mess.
I wonder sometimes about that, if there's some kind of woo-woo going on, that the plants are actually sentient, or how do what are they actually connected to? And because did Burbank get those crosses because of genetics, or did he get them because of his desire to get them, and the universe provided what he wanted? I mean,
I wonder about that too. Like, I feel like you develop a relationship with your plants, and it's not even something you can necessarily put into words easily. A
Right.
really good example of this. When I was doing my my PhD work, I traveled all over Australia collecting this particular genus of plants to study the chemicals in them, as you do. And I would be driving at like 100 kilometers an hour along all these highways for like days. And I was going off old herbarium records, but after I'd seen the habitats where these things liked to grow a few times, eventually I'd be driving along and I'd look out and I'd just be like, oh, they'll be over there. And I just knew, and I couldn't tell you how. I would have no way of letting another person know what was going through my mind. I just knew after spending time with these plants what they wanted. And similar things happened on my property, like planting certain tree species in different places and seeing that they do well in some spots and not in others. And after you do that a few times, you learn the feel of what these plants want from the world. And there's no way to put it into, like, I can't write a chapter in a book and tell other people how to do this.
It's almost not quantifiable. Yeah, sure.
Yes, yeah.
And
I suspect with plant breeding, there's other things going along like that.
I walk into a field of wheat, for example, and I see the one wheat plant that's different than the whole rest of the field. And other people walk into the field with me and they can't see it even when I point it out. One time a lady came into my garden and she asked if she could help weed, and I asked her to weed the garlic, and the garlic had grass growing in it, and she asked me, how do I tell the difference? And I'm like, I can't put that into words. You just look at it and they're so different.
Oh, a general question on the kind of the whole show that we're on. For Joseph, where do you see the doom in the future, and where do you see the optimism? I'm curious, because you normally stay very focused on the gardening, and I wonder what your opinions are on like the world and history and like where we are moving.
So I grew up as a good little Mormon boy, and the Mormon theology is that we're 1 year from the end of the world every single year of my whole life. And so to me, the gloom is just, it's just sitting there, and it's overwhelming. And what I see is things not crashing all of a sudden, but just each year there's a little thing that doesn't quite work as good as it did last year. And then the next year there's something else that doesn't work quite as good as it did the year before. And so that's where I come down on the gloom end of things. I mean, I grow my own food as much as I can. I preserve, a ton of food out of my garden. I sleep on the floor so that I don't have to be trapped in a bed in case I have to get up and move, because some people, that would kill them if they didn't have a bed to sleep in at night. I fast sometimes for like days at a row, because if an emergency comes along, I don't have to eat, because I've trained myself that food is optional, and so yeah, I'm plenty gloomy.
Do you think with what you've seen, and I think what you really both of your work really makes me very optimistic about the future or the potential future of food or the food systems that we're all a part of. And big focus on potential here, but are you optimistic about the future of food?
Yes, I am, because like around 20 years ago, there was a GMO corn failure in Africa. And so immediately the whole African agricultural system shifted to land races, in 1 year, in 2 years. And I see that happening. The potential for that to happening is really easy. It's really easy for people to adapt to. And once you start growing genetically diverse crops and saving your own seeds in your own garden, the local adaptation happens really quickly.
Yeah, I used to be much more gloomy, but now that I've seen how quickly crops can adapt from a relatively modest amount of starting diversity. And the other thing is, like, the atmosphere and the climate are shifting to some degree. And even if we had like a variety that had been grown for thousands of years, when things shift enough, it's not, it can be a useful starting point, but that crop would still have to change year to year.
Right.
So if you're starting from scratch, like we are in Australia, like we have pretty much no history of pre-industrial agriculture here, we're going to have to figure it all out on the fly. But yeah, particularly, I read a post about this a while ago. Like, permaculture often idolizes like tree crops and perennial crops, and there's been very few cultures in history that have relied on perennials, particularly tree crops. And when those trees have failed, they often don't get replaced. So like the chestnuts that used to be all through the US that all got wiped out by disease, the early settlers were like eating them regularly, but when they all died, nobody went out and replanted chestnuts. They just planted more corn because they didn't have the ability to wait that long to get a return. So like tree crops, I think, are essential as a buffer. They're great for using spaces that the land quality is too low for annual crops, but annual crops are still going to be the cornerstone of keeping people going. And they adapt and they change and they respond to our requests if we ask them nicely. In like, you can't just like crack the whip and make demands of them, but if you develop a relationship with them and you ask them the right way, it's amazing what they can do.
It's true. Joseph, I think your methods and approach convey a lot of sort of permanence and resilience, at least like from a food systems point of view. Do you subscribe to permaculture?
So
I know it can be divisive and political, but
my opinion of permaculture is basically that they took the kind of farming that my family's been doing for 10,000 years and they put a name on it and they called it permaculture. And so I don't really consider myself to be a permaculturist, specifically because I like tilling my soil. And the permaculturists really give me a bad time about that. and so, it's messy. But one of the sites I hang out on is a permaculture site, and so I offer what I can offer without stepping on toes.
I kind of see permaculture as like a really hyper-diverse, awkward grex. Like, all of these different ideas have been thrown into one bucket, and it doesn't really fit anywhere. It doesn't really work anywhere. But the ingredients that are in there can be picked and chosen and like winnowed down to just the tools that suit your particular circumstances. So I see it as useful in that way. Yeah.
Sure. If it's just about the tool set, then yeah, but
yeah, you have to
become much different.
Yeah, you have to pick and choose, and a lot of it is theory that needs to be put into practice before you can really be confident of it. But I'm very grateful that there was a permaculture movement. 100 years from now, I don't think it will be called permaculture, but it will contribute to a lot of other local cultures in some ways. So it's
permaculture theme that really resonates with me is the watching, the observing what's going
Observe,
on.
yeah.
Before you start tearing things apart, you ought to at least know what exists there currently.
Yeah. I'm absolutely an amateur. Like I've been gardening off and on for about 10 or more years now. But yeah, I found observe to be the one thing that's the most important and always the most overlooked in all of this. I like to forage as well. So like, as you were talking about before, like knowing what patterns to look for in nature, what things grow where. Do they like wet ground? Do they, does this plant grow under birch trees, or does it grow under beech trees, or does this mushroom grow on birch or beech, Um, yeah,
The thing I
observation.
reckon people are going to look back in like 100 years at permaculture and be baffled is using like cardboard and newspaper to grow lettuce. It's like any other time in history, they were like such precious, like energy intensive resources. Like the idea something as a valuable paper would just be spread everywhere. So yeah, it's a very transient solution. So yeah, those kind of excess industrial resources that we're drowning in at the moment, I don't think they're going to be around for very long.
That's for sure. Yeah. Joseph, I want to go to something in your book, which I think is like Shane might relate to as well, through his fiction here. But there's a passage in your book that stood out to me. Can I read it quickly?
Sure.
The civilized folks industrialized their food production system, sending hordes of robots into the fields and warehouses, with just enough low-paid workers to keep the robots operational. They spewed poisons into the air, land, water, and themselves. The living soil turned into dead dirt, and the rivers and oceans into dead zones. I really like that one. The picture you paint of industrial ag. I think it feels like it's some dystopian future, but if you actually look into it piece by piece, it's also very realistic. But it paints such a common picture of a dystopia while being accurate, I feel like.
So the rough draft of my book was really nasty towards industrial civilization, towards the chemical companies, towards the stupid choices that mega agriculturists are making. And I took all of that out, well, most of it out, for the sake of trying to advocate for people to do what they love.
Sure.
And just forget about sending all of that energy and worry towards things that I don't like. But yes, I did keep that in.
On that note, Joseph, as interest in local plant breeding increases, do you have any advice on what the minimum resources people need to get started? Because like I'm in a really privileged position. I've got more space than I know what to do with. No water though, but I've got plenty of space to play around with. So yeah, can you see ways for people with relatively small spaces to still do something meaningful?
The meaningful thing for small spaces is to make it a community effort. I mean, if I grow two, let's say squash plants, and my neighbor grows two squash plants, and the next neighbor down the road grows three squash plants, all of a sudden we're up to 8 squash plants, and that starts to become a really viable population. And the other thing that we can do if we're worried about generating seed is we can plant 20 squash plants in the same hole, and they'll fight among themselves and decide who's going to produce fruit, and that still gets large numbers of genetics out there. And so, and then we can plant some seeds from, our 2 squash this year and the 2 from the previous year and the 2 from the year before that, and so then our populations can be higher. And the other thing about population sizes is if we're dealing with genetically diverse crops to start with, then all of those rules that were put in place to deal with super inbred crops we can throw those out the window.
Mm. I actually wonder if there's an opportunity for people with really small amounts of space to do the fiddly wide cross work, because that takes a lot of attention to like when things are flowering and the techniques that you need. And you only need to grow like 3 different species that no one's ever tried crossing before, and put the time into lining up the flowering and getting the pollen on the anther and making that all work. And once you've got that first generation of hybrids, sending it out to other people who have the space to grow it out and see if there's any potential in it.
Right. I know a fellow who sent me tepary beans that he was cross-pollinating in his basement under grow lights. And he sent me the seeds to them. And for me, that was an explosion of genetic diversity that I couldn't have gotten any other way. But I'm dealing with 100 species. This huge field, and I go into the field and I might not even look at 99 of the species during a day. You know, and so that little fussy fiddly work can be done really good in a small garden.
Yeah, I find I can only handle about 1 species per year doing deliberate hand crosses, because it's just it's not just the total amount of hours. You have to be there at the exact right time when things are producing, before the bees strip all the pollen off the flowers, if you're not bagging absolutely everything. So yeah, I've got more space than I have attention.
So when I look at the pedigree of my promiscuous tomato project, that pedigree exists because this pollen donor and this mother were flowering at the same time while I was in the garden.
Yeah. Have you looked into much of the work for other, I guess you call them low-tech transgenesis techniques like mentagrafting?
I've only paid attention to it. I haven't actually done any of that kind of stuff.
It's on my radar as well, but again, like I could maybe handle 1 of those projects in a year and see if it produces anything.
Right.
But again, it's the kind of thing, if a person only had a small greenhouse in a backyard, but they had lots of time to fiddle with it, they could do work that no farmer has time to do.
Well, there's a project. If I was only working on one project, we have a wild relative of watermelon that grows here called Bryonia alba. And
yes.
it is perennial. And if I had one project to do, I would cross that with watermelon, and that mentor grafting might help with that cross and to develop a perennial watermelon. You know, and somebody could do that project. It probably won't be me, but
yeah, that was one of the questions on my list. If you were like immortal, what wild species would you try to domesticate?
But the Bryonia alba is really poisonous, and so it would be a project to work on.
Sure. We've got the poisonous cucumber here. I believe the wild cucumber, it's all spiky. I've always thought about that after taking the Landrace gardening courses, about mixing the microbes of similar species with like the wild varieties. But yeah.
Well, you look at the ancestors of a lot of crops, and they were like really nasty plants, but it's not hard to break complicated toxin systems like that.
On the note of breeding, Shane, you do a lot of like manual variety trials and manual crossing and back crossing. And Joseph, you do a lot more looking for, say, like natural hybrids and stuff like that. How do you guys feel about the opportunity of scale on both of those methods? Like Shane, do you think your method of these manual crossing is applicable and scalable? And Joseph, do you feel like the hybrid, or then looking for natural hybrids, is as well?
I see the hand crossing as something that you do in the early stages to overcome barriers. But with my cannas, for example, it took me a few years to get the wild species lined up with the cultivated clone that I had.
Mhm.
But now that I have that first generation of hybrids, which are better than either of the parents, they naturally set seed without me having to intervene. So I can now shift tactics and do mass selection.
So do these first early trials, do they require like distance separations?
Not necessarily. For me, the main problem was the cultivated strain had lost most of its fertility. And it had a weird flowering time compared to all the other species. So I had to figure out a way to get them all lined up. I wasted a year trying to store pollen, but that family, it's impossible. Well, it's closely related to banana, and they've got pollen that just dies like an hour after it's shed. So yeah, but I had to prove for myself that I tried drying it and freezing it and germinating it and looking at it under a microscope. And a year later, I'd convinced myself there was no way to make that happen. And then I came up with the low-tech idea of just cutting back the wild species halfway through their growing system to kind of reset their clock, and they were flowered at the same time. So it didn't take a laboratory. It just took a harebrained idea that may not have worked, but I just had to give it a go. I had another question. Do you have any thoughts about the growing impact of the biosecurity state, for want of a better word, on amateur plant breeders? Or is that something that you kind of, I mean, you're a little bit lucky in the US, like you've got more genetic resources on hand, and your barriers internationally aren't quite as bad as they are in Australia.
So about 15 years ago, the USDA raided my farm because somebody from Russia had sent me potato seeds.
Wow.
And so biosecurity is a real threat to the small scale farmers and small scale plant breeders. And I observe a lot of smuggling going on. I also observe people taking stuff out of the grocery stores and planting those seeds, because those grocery store produce is crossing borders without phytosanitary, and they're perfectly good plant material. And so I observe a lot of that going on as well.
It's interesting too, like of all of the, well, I'll put it this way, like biology has this self-replicating nature built into it. Like we talk about AI, like replicating itself and taking over the world. It's like, you're like 4 billion years too late, AI. We've already got like the perfect machine that is one tiny seed. There's no limit to how much it can propagate. So yeah, I kind of I understand the motivation of where that apparatus is coming from the government's perspective. Like they're trying to protect these fragile mega farms where there's like thousands of acres of one clone. And regardless of like whether everyone complies with their orders, those farms are going to fail routinely based on their business model.
Right.
Yeah,
well,
like
history has shown that when we start cloning plants, that they're susceptible to complete total crop failure, like the Irish potato famine, the 1970s corn blight in the US.
Panama disease and bananas.
Yeah, the bananas, the Arabica coffee is currently, the worldwide population is threatened by some disease. The rust that's threatening the wheat crop, and so to me, I welcome diseases and pests and whatnot into my garden because they are the teachers of my plants, teaching them how to be strong. But everybody doesn't share my attitude.
I kind of view these alternative agricultural systems as a seed that is waiting for the right time in history to germinate. And there's no point fighting the mega industrial conglomerate corporations because they're going away on their own. It's like a tree that's like dying. You can chop it down if you want. It might land on top of you in the process, or you can just let it disintegrate and, go and do your own thing in the margins.
Exactly. And landrace gardening is definitely for the margins, is how I see it for current conditions. And
I had one question on Fukuoka.
uh-huh.
So I don't know if you're aware, but he died thinking that his life's work was a failure. Like he was
Oh no.
convinced that, yeah, in the later stages of his life, where he kind of withdrew from the public eye, he basically considered that he'd achieved nothing and
Uh-huh.
died kind of a very disappointed and bitter man. Do you have any hopes or aspirations or thoughts about like what your legacy is, that because you're starting to scale back the amount of like farm
Um,
work that you're doing?
so this is my legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And if that was the only thing I accomplished in my life, I would be perfectly happy with that.
Mm.
Um, Another legacy that I have is when I was about 5 years old, me and my daddy planted a row of um, blue spruce trees along the edge of our property. It's like 150 feet long. Uh, and I think of all the birds that nested in that over the years, and the mice and the beauty that it brought into town. And I'm like, even if that was all I had done in my life, that would be enough.
Mm. Surely all of the crops that you've worked on and shared with other people, like that's a tidal wave of influence that there's no stopping it. Like it's just in so many
Right.
places, going in so
Well,
many directions.
if I can get a variety of tomato that people think tastes good and it is 100% outcrossing, if I can do that one project before I die, and that will change the agricultural world.
Mm.
And so that's the one project that I keep working on, even if I don't have strength to work on anything else.
Yeah, I think with me, my main priority is leaving this region with a reliable staple crop because we don't have one.
Mm-hmm.
So the grain crops don't grow here because the rains come too irregularly and we've got clouds of parrots and birds.
Right.
So like there's so much pest pressure because there's so much wildness in Australia. And yeah, I see canna as being the only potential starch crop that people can grow relatively reliably here.
Nice and pretty
Mm.
besides, huh?
Oh yeah. It's weird. Ever since I've been little, I've always had an affinity with them, and when they came through my trials as the only thing that really worked here, it
Uh-huh.
was I don't know. It's like they've been whispering to me ever since I've known them.
How nice. Um, the the direction that my life has been taking in recent years is to seed the wildlands with species that are more food product or that are more capable of producing human food,
Mm.
and they can just grow wild in the ecosystem. And 1,000 years from now, people will come into the forests here and they'll be picking the trees and never realize that someone planted those intentionally.
Mm.
And
Well, that's like Brazil nuts in Brazil. Like they've studied where they're growing and how they're arranged, and they're pretty sure that they are a legacy from that civilization that's more or less gone now, but it carries on in all of these like semi-wild stands of crops that they developed for thousands of years.
right.
Oh, can you tell us about any other plant breeders that you know who you think deserve more appreciation?
Oh, I know hundreds. How do I how do I list one? Um, so the most popular page on my website is how to grow potatoes from true seeds. And I always send people to William Whitston of cultivariable
Mm.
because I mean, my potato breeding is like, and his is just this amazing. And he's working with other crops from like root crops from the Andes and just doing a lot of careful, reliable work. The Experimental Farm Network is doing a lot of really nice stuff. There's a fellow, Casey Piscura, I think, out of Colorado, that's doing a lot of nice plant breeding for high elevation climates. Anyway, on and on.
What do you
that's
think
great.
we can do to encourage more people to get involved in the? I hesitate to call it a hobby. It's I don't know, vocation, calling,
Yeah.
whatever.
So the two things is it doesn't have to be as hard as the seed saving books want to make it, because you don't have to worry about population sizes. You don't have to worry about isolation distances. You don't have to worry about it being wrong. If you say right from the start, I value cross-pollination. Cross-pollination is my friend. Cross-pollination allows the seeds to select for themselves how they're going to deal with the ecosystem. And so that whole idea of cross-pollination allows you to drop all of the fear and the anxiety about doing it wrong.
You inspired me to reduce the amount of labeling that I do. So
Well,
like I only keep notes now to avoid myself buying the same thing twice. And like discovering, oh, it's no good the second time. Though even then, often something with the same label will be completely different. So you can't necessarily trust anything that's written down. The plants have to speak for themselves.
Well, I was, in my analytical chemistry mindset when I first started plant breeding, and I was keeping meticulous records. And then one day I realized I had spent more time keeping records than I had actually doing planting. And the record keeping stopped that day because I keep like the year that I harvested a seed, and that's about it.
Yeah.
Because I can look at a bean and I can say, oh, that's a bean. And
Sure.
that's
The record's in the seed.
Exactly. Yeah. There's vastly more information that's carried in the plant.
Sure.
And yes,
I think, sorry.
I do get beat up sometimes by people that badmouth me for forgetting the names and the stories, but I'm dealing with 1,000 varieties, and you just can't keep track of it. And so the way I counteract that is I say, there was 10,000 years worth of plant breeders that were doing this work, and the heirloom purists, they only know about the most recent generation, so I'm only forgetting 1,000%, and they're forgetting 999,000%, whatever.
Oh, you mentioned about how many amazing crops there are in South America, like originating in South America. Do you have any theories about like why that place turned into such like a hotspot of domestication? Like they just seem to have such a knack.
I think it's the mountains, because in a little narrow, like in 20 miles or whatever, you go from sea level up to the tops of the mountains, and that is like 100 ecosystems all jumbled up together.
Yeah, and they're all kind of connected to each other but distinct.
Right, and I think South America, I think the plants really benefited from that kind of arrangement.
I almost wonder if lots of different growers posting seed to each other all over the world could reproduce that kind of effect.
I think it will.
Yeah, we've got so many resources at our fingertips at this time in history that
Mhm.
a plant breeder from even 100 years ago would kill to get their hands on so much information and material when they needed it.
Right. Well, like on my farm, I grow 5,000 different varieties of sweet corn because every seed that I plant is a different variety.
Mm.
And so I don't care at all if if an heirloom variety goes bye-bye, because I got 5,000 of them,
Mm.
you know, and 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 those 5,000 are going out to the whole world, and they're coming back to me. And yeah, it's really a beautiful time to be a plant breeder.
It's funny though, on the grain side of things, I've been lucky to develop a population of flour corn that does reasonably well here, but I've never had any luck with a winter corn, winter grain. So all of the domesticated ones that I've managed to, the small amount that I managed to get my hands on in trial, we've got clouds of finches here, like little tiny seed-eating birds, just so many of them, and they destroy everything. Occasionally they've been really cruel. They haven't noticed something the first year, and I'm like, oh, I finally found something, and I can grow it. And then the next year they figure it out, and it's like, never again. They're never going to forget. But there's a weedy grain here, Bromus catharticus, and we called it wild oat because it kind of looks like that, but it's not that closely related. And I've been looking at it ever since I was a kid. It's like, and again, one of these things that's just been calling to me for so long, and I'm like, it's got fairly large seeds, grows through the winter like a wheat or an oat. Where does it come from? Does it have any history of edibility, or should I just try eating it and see if I get ergot poisoning? So I looked into it recently, and it comes from South America in a region similar latitude to us. And the indigenous people used to use it as a staple crop before Europeans turned up and shook everything up. So now I'm looking at this thing thinking, should I be starting to breed this from basically a weed into a staple crop?
Right.
And it wouldn't be that different to what happened in the Middle East. So in the Fertile Crescent, oats was a weed that carried along with more desirable things like wheat and oats. And when that package of species got to Northern Europe, where it was too cold and wet and horrible for wheat to do really well, that's where people domesticated the oat and turned that into the crop, which had previously been the weed, the annoying thing that people were, trying to minimize all along. That ended up being the resource. So yeah, I don't know. There's all these opportunities like right in front of you, and you just have to, find your attention drawn to something long enough to interact with it.
Right.
Yeah. Back to the domestication thing, Shane. Why do you have any theories on why there's so much domestication coming from South America and those plants?
Yeah, it's tricky because like you get these little pockets around the world where like multiple species are domesticated or like almost at the same time. And yeah, I don't have any concrete theories. I think the idea of those linked ecosystems, those linked diverse ecosystems is a big one. Having a hyper diverse population of that genus really helps as well too. So like with the potatoes, there's like how many 100 wild species in the Andes that the humans could tap into. And not only that, like once you have a domesticated strain, it would often backcross to its wild ancestors to keep injecting more diversity to stop it becoming too inbred. So I think they're all parts of it, but I can't help wondering if part of it is cultural as well too, that there's just certain peoples which coincidentally are open to those kind of new relationships, those new intimate relationships with the world around them. Animal domestication is probably even more interesting, but that's
Sure.
And it's another one where I think there's lots of possibilities that are just lying around in plain sight. But do you know the Belyaev fox experiment in the USSR?
No.
So they farm wild foxes in Russia for fur, and a scientist was interested to see if they could domesticate foxes to make them easier to handle and like so they wouldn't stress so much in a farming situation. So all he did was take newborn foxes, reach into the cage, and then observe their reaction. So a lot of them would like bite or like scrabble away, but a small percentage of them would be like curious or calm. So he took out that 5% of the population that were calm, and within, I think, 5 generations, they had pretty much domestic dog behavior in foxes. But all of these other traits came along too, like floppy ears and patches in their coats, things that you see in domestic dogs that they didn't select for, but they came along because of the
Wow.
underlying biochemistry of all mammals. And there's no reason to think that any animal couldn't be domesticated. I would really love to see more insect domestication, because we've only really done
Yeah.
honeybees and silkworms, and insects reproduce so much more rapidly than anything else. They're trickier to handle, because like they're a bit better at escaping if they don't want to hang around.
Even on the opposite approach, though, Joseph, you had a bit in your book about sort of influencing the behavior of the Colorado mountain beetle, or
Oh,
potato
yeah.
beetle, I think.
So in my garden, I have a native weed, which is Solanum physalicifolium, which is the native food crop of the Colorado potato beetle. And so I grow that crop. I allow it to be weedy in my garden so that the Colorado potato beetles can always eat that crop. They always have a food source. But if I ever see one of those beetles on a potato, an eggplant, a pepper, whatever other species of solanum, I kill it. And if the plant attracts those beetles more than once, I kill the plant too. So that what I end up doing is I end up training the beetles that they only have one plant that's safe. And because they're a resident species, they don't migrate in from elsewhere. It works that way. I couldn't do that same thing with the cabbage moth or the cabbage white moths, because they blow in on the wind.
Right.
It's really interesting. I see something similar in my gardens with Solanum nigrum is our local weedy solanum, and it gets the 28 spot ladybugs on it. But I rarely see them move across and onto my crops. The only exception is when I overuse nitrogen. So have you followed any of John Kempf's work? He does advancing. No, he does a regenerative agriculture podcast, but he's really interested in the link between plant nutrition and pests and diseases. So the really interesting theory is that plants can't control how much nitrogen they absorb from their roots, because it's usually a limiting ingredient. They just suck up as much of it as they possibly can, because they so rarely have existed in situations where that's a bad idea.
Right.
It's similar to some cacti and succulents. If you pour water on them, they'll just swell up until they split, because they for millions of years they've never had an opportunity to do that, so they don't know how to stop themselves. So when plants absorb lots of nitrogen, it can accumulate in the sap as free amino acids, which is like the transportation form of it, because the plant can't convert that into finished protein fast enough due to some other rate limiting ingredient. So most insects can't digest protein. They can only incorporate those free amino acids into their body to grow. And when they tap into a rich resource of that, it's like rocket fuel. You'll like suddenly go through generations of insects and you'll get a population explosion. So I've seen this in my own crops. If I apply nitrogen to, thinking I'm doing the right thing to a crop that's already growing fine, within literally a day or two, a plague of insects will descend on it, either sucking the sap out of it or defoliating it. And it's just that balance. It's too much nitrogen, more than the plant actually needs. We had a similar phenomenon recently. We had a plague of butterflies. Like every native species of butterfly just exploded in numbers, and there were clouds and clouds of them everywhere. All of these plants being defoliated we've never seen before. And I thought back, it's like, what could have brought this on? And we actually had a series of thunderstorms, of just the right kind of thunderstorms that actually fix nitrogen from the air. And after those storms, everywhere was glowing green. Like we just had a handful of osmocote like thrown on the entire district, and there was just too much nitrogen for the ecosystem to handle. So it changes the way you view the insects. They're not, they're not the enemies of the plants. They're actually acting as a pressure release valve when there's an imbalance in the system, and it allows it to, it's like a waterfall. Like once it reaches the top of a barrier, it'll flow over into the next, layer of the ecosystem. And I think I see the opposite as well. Sometimes you'll plant a crop and it'll germinate and then it just sits there and it doesn't die. I've had this with tree seedlings that I've planted out, and 5 years later you go back and it's exactly the same size as you put it in, and it might grow a leaf and lose a leaf, grow a leaf. And there's some mismatch between what the soil is offering it and what its roots can actually access. So it's just kind of in limbo. I've even seen this with different strains of the same species planted side by side, that one of them will get to maturity within 5 years and the other one hasn't shifted an inch since I planted it. And there's something really interesting going on there with how the plant is relating to the soil, I think, is the rate limiting step normally when that happens. Joseph, do you have any plans to write any more books?
I have one more book in the works. One of the complaints about landrace gardening is people said it was too theoretical and not enough hands-on. And so I'm intending a more hands-on version, or a more hands-on version. We're going to call it Victory Gardening. And then I didn't really know how to write a book when I wrote Landrace Gardening, and so a second edition has got to come along in about 5 years. And people gave me a lot of feedback and a lot of questions that I could have answered and I would answer next time. And so
brilliant.
Second edition's in the work, maybe 4 years from now.
Nice. Well,
I have one general question as well.
Yes.
So there's been a few amateur, for want of a better word, plant breeding podcasts that have kind of popped up and done a few episodes. I think the Open Source Seed Initiative had one for a while. I think Cultivariable, I think Whitson had one too, but he decided it wasn't worth his time. Do you think that there's a need for a podcast which talks to different amateur plant breeders?
So I also started a podcast on GoingToSeed.org, and we're 2 episodes into it. And the problem with podcasts is they require a lot of reliability and consistency. And plant breeders don't tend to have that because we're more happy-go-lucky. And so we'll see how long it lasts. But I think that, the right person could pull it off.
Well, I would be very interested to be involved in that. So if you need another set of hands, because I think one person trying to take on all of the production on their own is a recipe for burnout. Like even if you're doing really well after 6 months, you normally throw your hands in the air. So hook me in on that if you want. I'd love to be involved.
We're definitely looking for guests.
I've always got something to blather on about. So yeah, let me know.
We're currently booked for about 3 or 4 months out, but if you don't mind, we'll get in contact.
Brilliant. I look forward to it.
Nice. I have one more quick question for each of you. If people wanted to get started this season with breeding their own plants, how would you tell them to get started? Or what can they do?
So my advice would be to plant your 2 favorite varieties side by side and let them cross-pollinate. Plant 3 varieties if you want, and save the seeds. Plant the seeds next year.
My advice would be for someone who's never vegetable gardened before, and I would say put aside your first year to plant as many different varieties as possible and just see what actually likes your soil. Because you might be like, oh, I really, really want to grow tomatoes, and you've just got conditions that are going to be really tough for tomatoes. You don't really know that until you start. And just planting everything and not amending the soil and just observing and being content with probably not getting much of a crop the first year. I think that's probably a good acid test to develop the attitude of just, letting things either live or die and seeing what your land can actually do on its own.
I love that,
Sure.
Shane.
And share the process with other people, because if you're going to buy 50 packets of seed, you're not going to need all of the seed from every packet. So you could take that same set of 50 seed and divide it up with 4 or 5 of your friends and then compare notes. Like, you might find out that you're really good at growing eggplants and someone else is really good at growing cabbages, and you don't have to you can stay in touch for that reason. You can swap produce that way.
Oh, that's great. Well, thank you both very much for joining us here.
Thank you, Simon.
It's a
Shane.
great pleasure, and I hope people get really inspired to grow more vegetables and breed some stuff themselves and share with their friends.
Brilliant. Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.